There are women who all their lives want someone to wait for them, not because of beauty nor because of duty, just because they deserve someone to see them. Deep inside, Joanna Lynn was one such woman. 48 years old, her face was lined with time, and her hands were rough from years of being patient in a family that never needed her. When the matchmaker told her that there was a man looking for a wife out west, a small farm near the Arizona territory, Joanna didn't ask much. She just nodded and packed up an old wooden suitcase. Part of her believed that if life had ever abandoned her so many times, perhaps this train ride would be her last chance to be needed. But when Joanna arrived in town, what awaited her was not a handshake or a warm greeting. The one she had been promised by letter, had left, taking his money and the last shred of trust in her. No one met her at the station. No one paid any attention to the woman standing there in her ash-colored dress, hunched with fatigue and blinded with shame. And when she decided to leave town, her only remaining hope was swept away in another nightmare, a sudden, ferocious, and brutal Apache raid. Joanna couldn't run fast enough, and perhaps if it weren't for a strange man lying motionless behind a large rock, his uniform stained with blood, and his eyes still half closed, this story would have ended right there. But he, by some strange instinct, reached out to shield a strange woman, a forsaken woman and a wounded soldier. Amidst the red sand and the howling wind, two people with nothing left to lose found each other. It wasn't the kind of loneliness that came from simply being alone. It was the kind that lived in your bones, the kind that followed you from town to town like a shadow too familiar to fear, but too heavy to carry for long. Joanna Elkin sat stiffly on the back of a buckboard wagon, her fingers laced around a folded lace handkerchief that once belonged to her mother. At 51, she had seen the death of two brothers, buried her parents, and endured a marriage that felt more like servitude than sanctuary. And now in the golden dusk of her life, she found herself a mail-order bride, only to be left behind before the groom even showed his face. He'd sent word by telegram, "Change my mind. Don't come." But the message had arrived 2 days too late. By then, Joanna was already halfway across the territory, her entire life packed in a wooden chest, no larger than a nightstand. And now on the edge of New Mexico territory, in a town whose name she hadn't even learned to pronounce, she was alone, unclaimed, unwanted, and worst of all, expected to disappear quietly. The innkeeper at the outpost had been kind in that curt, wary way frontier folk offered to strangers. But kindness couldn't fill a hollow belly or patch the hole that years of rejection had worn in her heart. When she finally settled into the corner of the one-room lodging, she didn't cry. She hadn't done that in years, not since the night her first husband told her she was too slow, too clumsy, and too dried up to be looked at twice. She'd believed him for decades, but what Joanna couldn't know not yet was that fate was not done with her, not even close. Out there beyond the cottonwood trees and sagebrush hills, a storm was stirring. Not just in the land, but in the world of men. In the borderlands beyond civilization's reach, raiding parties moved like wind across rock. And one such raid was about to change everything. It would take only minutes. The wrong place, the wrong time, and the woman no one claimed would be thrust into the center of a war not her own. And from the ash of that night would rise a name she hadn't heard yet. A man who bled and burned, yet still chose to shield her. Not out of duty, but because something in her silence looked like the kind of dignity even soldiers bowed to. But we're not there yet. Tonight, Joanna pulled her shawl tighter and whispered to no one, "If I must live, Lord, at least let it matter." And somewhere in the distance, a rifle cracked through the twilight. She thought she had been discarded by the world. But in the heart of the desert, her worth would be seen by the last man she ever expected, a wounded stranger who'd forgotten how to live, until he had to protect her. The fire came with no warning. Joanna had barely finished folding the single quilt atop her cot when the screaming began, first a panicked horse, then a gunshot, then the unmistakable sound of boots thundering against earth. Her breath caught in her throat as the innkeeper's wife burst through the door, eyes wild. "Raiders," she panted. Out back now, Joanna moved without thinking. She grabbed her shawl, her satchel, and not much else because instinct didn't wait for sentiment. Outside, chaos had swallowed the tiny outpost. Smoke rolled in thick sheets over the rooftops, and figures on horseback moved like shadows carved from nightmares. Arrows sailed like birds with fire-tipped wings. It wasn't war. It was survival. She ran through, her knees ached and her lungs burned, though the Arizona dusk felt like boiling water on her skin. Through a jagged fence down a dry creek bed. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stop. It was there beside the twisted limbs of a downed cottonwood tree that she first saw him. He was half conscious, slumped against a rock, one hand pressed to his side, where blood bloomed through a torn cavalry coat. A rifle lay beside him untouched. A horse riderless pawed the dust nearby ears, twitching with every gunshot that echoed through the valley. At first, Joanna thought he was dead. Then his head turned, just slightly, and his eyes, mud-gray and blurred with pain, locked onto hers. "Leave me," he croaked. But Joanna Elkins had spent her entire life being told to leave the room when she wasn't pretty enough, to leave the table when her opinions were too much, to leave the marriage when it no longer suited her husband. Not this time. She dropped to her knees beside him, and without asking, tore her shawl into strips and pressed it to his wound. "I don't leave people behind," she said softly. He gave her a look, half disbelief, half sorrow, and whispered, "Then we'll die together." But Joanna, for the first time in years, didn't feel afraid. Not truly. Something about his voice, tired, battered, but still holding the line, made her feel steadier, as if someone else was still holding on, even if just barely. They lay still until the stars came out. The noise of the raid faded. The desert quiet returned, not peaceful, but empty in a way that made you listen harder to your own breathing. That night, beside a man she didn't know, and with only the desert to bear witness, Joanna held pressure to a wound and whispered her name. "Joanna," she said, "I'm nobody, but I'm still here." The man didn't reply, but his eyes fluttered just a little, and in the deepest part of that awful night, the two of them, forgotten, broken, cast aside, began something they didn't have a name for yet. He was supposed to die alone in the dust, and she was supposed to vanish without being missed. But sometimes mercy finds the most forgotten of us first. Joanna woke before the sun, or maybe she hadn't slept at all. The desert air had turned sharp with cold, and the man beside her, still bleeding, still alive, shivered in his half-conscious state. She had tried to keep the wound clean, to press down as the blood slowed, but she wasn't trained for this. Her hands were too soft for such things, but she didn't stop trying. She never had. When dawn finally peeled across the sky like the lifting of a heavy curtain, Joanna knelt close and studied him. The pain etched across his face was raw but quiet. His jaw, unshaven and weathered, tightened with every breath, but he hadn't once begged for comfort. Not like her first husband, not like the men in town who had smiled at her until they saw her age, her body, the years written in the corners of her eyes. This man had seen her, bleeding and breathless in the night, and still he hadn't turned away. His voice broke the stillness like a crack in dry earth. "You ain't from here." "No," she said. "I came to marry a man who didn't show." A long pause. "Then maybe we're both the left behinds." He said his name was August Kane, former cavalry scout, widow, wounded in body, and if Joanna had to guess, in soul too. They shared sips from her canteen, broke a dry biscuit in half, spoke in sentences that floated in the air a little longer than needed. But even in that slowness, something shifted. Not quite trust, not yet, but understanding. Joanna tried not to feel the weight of her own contradictions. She had wanted a fresh start. She had hoped someone in this dust-covered state would see beyond her gray-streaked hair, her round figure, her slowness on rough terrain. Yet here she was, kneeling over a dying man, carrying more purpose in her hands than any marriage promise had ever given her. And still a voice in her kept whispering, "You're not enough. You're too old, too clumsy, too late to be loved for real." That voice had her mother's tone, her ex-husband's sneer, the train conductor's awkward glance, the silence of the man she was supposed to marry. Joanna stared at August's torn flesh, his barely there breath. She pressed the bandage again and whispered, "But I stayed. Doesn't that count for something?" He didn't answer. But his hand, rough as bark, found hers and held it weakly. His eyes met hers, no pity, just a kind of tired reverence. Maybe staying was the beginning. Maybe in this empty nowhere, staying was everything. She came west to find a husband, but instead found a dying stranger who saw her worth in silence. But how long can two broken people keep the wilderness at bay? The wind came hard that night. It moaned through the canyon like a sorrow long held, scraping across stone and brittle sagebrush. Joanna built the fire higher, the flames flickering golden orange against the rock wall, casting soft light over August's pale face. He hadn't spoken in hours. Fever rose behind his eyes. She kept wetting his brow with her scarf, whispering things she hadn't told another soul in decades. Stories of Tennessee, of the little house she once dreamed to fill with children, of the father who told her she was a good girl but not a pretty one, of the preacher's son who married her out of duty, not love. She wasn't even sure he heard, but maybe saying them aloud made them real, made her real. She hadn't felt real in a long time, just useful, or not. Just the woman with wide hips, the one who walks heavy, too old to catch another man now. That's what they'd said at the depot when her fiancé never showed, and the ticket agent offered her a bench to wait, as if her hopes could be set down beside her like old luggage. Forgotten. She leaned back against the cool rock, arms wrapped tight around her own body. "Why'd you come out here?" August asked suddenly. His voice was gravel and smoke. She jumped. "I thought you were asleep." "I was. Then I heard the truth in your voice. That'll wake a man." Joanna swallowed. "I wanted to be chosen. Just once. Not for what I could do, or cook, or clean. Just chosen." August winced, shifting. So did I. Their eyes met through the firelight. Not romance. Not yet. Just recognition. A moment of two people sitting inside the same ache, naming it without shame. Joanna reached over, brushing dirt from his shoulder. He caught her wrist gently. "You stayed," he murmured. She nodded. "I couldn't leave." A silence settled between them, not awkward, just weighty like two rivers learning to merge. But still, she wondered, was she only needed because he was broken? Or had the universe in its dusty Wild West way finally paired two discarded souls and offered them one last chance? Joanna didn't know. But she would stay, through the storm, through the doubt, through the firelight and whatever waited come dawn. He saw the truth in her voice before he saw her body. But can two scarred hearts trust what flickers in firelight and not mistake it for something that will vanish by morning? By the time the storm passed both outside and within, something in Joanna had shifted. It wasn't sudden like a thunderclap. It was slow like the melting of snow on a sunlit roof, the kind of thaw that no one notices until the drip starts to sing. August could walk again just a few feet at a time, leaning heavily on a pine staff. He insisted on moving, said it was better than being still and feeling useless. Joanna understood that too well, the ache of stillness, of waiting to matter. She no longer hovered over him like a nurse. Instead, they moved together side by side. She gathered kindling. He cleaned the rifle. She boiled stew. He mended a strap on her boot, not out of chivalry, out of partnership. One night after supper, August handed her a folded piece of worn paper. The handwriting was shaky. "It's my discharge letter," he said. "I've been carrying it around like a badge and a burden." Joanna unfolded it with care. The Army's cold words spilled across the page. Wounded, unsuitable for continued service, honorably dismissed. "You know," he said softly, "I spent years thinking that line, unsuitable, defined me. I let it eat up what was left of the man I used to be." Joanna looked up, tears catching light at the rim of her lashes. "You're not unsuitable." He gave a quiet smile. "Neither are you." They sat in silence for a long time. But it was not empty. It was full of something tender, unnamed. When August finally reached over and took her hand, it was not a grand gesture. It was simple, warm, a silent promise between two people who'd stopped asking the world for permission to feel. And Joanna didn't flinch. She didn't pull back. She let his fingers settle over hers, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel too much, or too old, or too anything. She just felt held. And in that quiet contact, forgiveness bloomed. Not for others, for herself, forever believing she had to earn being chosen. When a man who lost everything takes your hand without asking for beauty or proof, you begin to wonder, was love always meant to be this gentle spring in the high desert comes quietly? It doesn't shout with color like back east. Here it creeps in on soft sage winds and the tentative bloom of wild lupine, like hope whispering instead of declaring. For Joanna and August, the change in season mirrored something stirring between them, delicate but persistent like grass, pushing through cracks in stone. He built her a rocking chair out of old fence wood. She mended his cavalry coat, sewing it back together with blue thread and steady hands. And though neither of them spoke the word, love, it hung between them like smoke from the hearth, unmistakable even if unspoken. But the world has a way of knocking on the door just when the soul begins to rest. A rider from the fort showed up one afternoon, a young scout with a jittery horse and sandblasted eyes. "They've sent search parties, ma'am. Looking for you. Thought you was taken or dead. The man who ordered you, Mr. Bellamy, he filed a report and left town. Said you ran." Joanna said nothing. She only stared into the distance, her face unreadable. But her hands clenched around her apron like they were holding back an entire storm. August stepped forward, his limp more pronounced after days of work. "She didn't run," he said. "She survived." The scout looked between them and seemed to understand what wasn't said. He nodded once respectfully, then handed her a letter. "You're free to come back or stay here. No one's forcing anything now." That night by firelight, Joanna held the letter unopened. "I thought I came here to marry a man named Bellamy," she whispered. "But now I know. I came to find myself." August poured 2 tin cups of coffee. He said nothing. He didn't have to, because in his silence, she felt everything: respect, affection, patience. Things she'd waited decades to feel without shame. "Do you think people like us, people with bruised histories, can really begin again?" she asked. August stirred the fire, then looked at her. Really looked. "We don't begin again," he said. "We begin where we are, and that's enough." Joanna smiled. Not wide, but deep. And suddenly the word home wasn't just a cabin. It was a man, a silence, a season turning. A place where her name wasn't a burden, but a blessing. When the past comes knocking and the heart finally has a choice, will she go back to the world that judged her? Or stay where love asks nothing but truth? The weeks after the scout's departure drifted by like pages turning in a book. Neither Joanna nor August wanted to end. The letter from Mr. Bellamy remained unopened, resting on the windowsill, yellowing beneath the morning sun and soft evening dust. Eventually it blew away in a storm. Neither of them chased it. Joanna found herself settling into the rhythm of the land, not as someone passing through, but as someone who belonged. She learned to walk the ridge trail without stumbling. She helped August plant spring root vegetables in his little plot behind the cabin. Her laughter, once tucked behind a veil of politeness and fear, began to ring out like birdsong again. One morning as she poured water into the basin, she caught her reflection in the tin mirror. The lines on her face hadn't vanished. Her frame still bore the shape of years lived in other people's expectations. But her eyes, once dimmed by disappointment, held a quiet shine. She was not beautiful by the world's standards. But here in this forgotten corner of the West, she had become something rarer seen. That evening, August brought her a carved wooden box. "I started it years ago," he said after the war. "Kept meaning to finish it, but never found a reason." Inside was a simple silver ring forged from melted scraps of cavalry buttons. "I don't want to marry you because I rescued you," he said. "I want to marry you because you stayed when you didn't have to." Joanna's hands trembled, not from fear but from awe. And then with a tenderness that couldn't be rushed, she nodded. There was no ceremony, no gown, no music. Just 2 people who had been broken by the world and had dared to believe that healing might still be possible. They stood under a canopy of desert stars and exchanged no vows, only glances that said, "I choose you," with a conviction no preacher's words could improve upon. As the night deepened, they sat on the porch side by side. A fire cracked softly. Somewhere a coyote sang. "I used to think I was abandoned," Joanna whispered, "but now I see I was just being led here." August rested a hand gently on hers. "Sometimes," he said, "God doesn't rescue us from the storm. He just sends someone to walk through it with us." And there, under the quiet skies of the New Mexico frontier, 2 souls once deemed too broken, too forgotten, too strange, finally found where they belonged. Together. They weren't young. They weren't perfect. But they were true. And sometimes, that's all love needs to last a lifetime. Would you like a gentle epilogue, or should we begin a new journey? Not everyone is born to be loved properly. Some people grow up knowing how to quietly retreat into themselves, hiding in the crowd, because they were called too old, too fat, too useless to be chosen. But sometimes what we need is not a perfect person, but someone who stays when everyone else has left. Joanna, who was abandoned, forgotten, found a place no one thought she would reach, a warm home in the heart of someone who also had an unhealed wound. They did not promise anything great. They just lit a small lamp in the middle of the forest, cooked a simple meal, and called each other by the gentlest name, their person. And perhaps that is the most beautiful thing that this life can give to someone. Thank you for listening to this story to the end. If you believe that gentle things still deserve to be told, please follow the channel None Wild West Saga. Share this video to those who need a little hope. Would you like to see a sequel or similar healing love stories? Leave a comment below, because every word you write is a small fire that warms the hearts that have been forgotten.